Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 34. In this week's episode, I want to talk about change. Why can change sometimes feel so scary? Why do we resist change as opposed to welcoming it into our lives? And the first thing that comes to mind in reflecting on these ideas is this very classic role reversal that I'm sure so many of us have experienced, where we were raised in an environment where we felt like we had no control over our situation, to then moving into adulthood and craving that stability that we lacked throughout our childhood. And I think one of the ways to do this is attempting to control everything around you, yourself, your relationships, and your environment. I think when you're raised by emotionally immature parents, your environment can feel so chaotic and traumatic, either emotionally or physically volatile. And so I think it's completely normal as we move into adulthood and we're able to finally distance ourselves and start creating our own life, that we would naturally gravitate more towards that stability, towards predictability, because throughout our childhood, that is what felt safe. That is what felt good. When things were steady and predictable, you were able to anticipate what was coming next. You knew how people might feel, what you should say or do to receive the best outcome. I think when you exist in a chaotic and an unpredictable environment for so long, it can be so exhausting that sometimes you want to be able to know what's ahead. A really classic characteristic of emotionally immature parents, I think, is having a hard time managing change. And that covers a wide range of behaviors and reactions and experiences. Everything from a very small change of plans in timing all the way up to a significant life change. Reflecting on my own experience, whether it was done to me or another family member, there were a number of times where a small change of plans would trigger this unnecessary domino effect as a way of teaching this person a lesson to never do that thing again, to never be the source of any kind of change. It could be something as small as someone saying, oh, well, I'll be home at 5 o'clock, and changing that to actually being home at 5:30. Now that you're home 30 minutes later, well, the plans for the rest of the day can't happen because, oh, well, now we're going to be late here and the traffic is going to be too bad at this time. And, well, no, I wanted to go now, but I'm going to feel rushed, so I don't even want to go anymore. And so they make you feel so bad for these very minor instances that the more rational side of your brain is telling you is not actually that big of a deal. It doesn't need to be the catalyst for an entire change of plans for the rest of the day, because everything that we had already had planned can still happen. This didn't actually have an impact on any of these things. But I think an emotionally immature parent will view this as an opportunity to guilt you into not falling into that role again, to kind of guilt you into never changing the plan, because I think change is something that is really challenging for them. I think also talking about these more substantial life changes. I remember when I first met my husband, I was bringing someone new into my life and indirectly into the family dynamic. And that was the first time that I was ever in a serious relationship, especially for an extended period of time. And so naturally, that changed the dynamic between myself and my family. I was spending more time outside of the house with this new person, and I think that was really challenging for my parents to navigate. And that was kind of the source of a lot of stress and a lot of tension and negativity between my parents and myself. And it was upsetting to me because even looking back on that time in my life, I was so excited because I was falling in love for the first time in my life. And I was trying to understand what all of these feelings were. And yet I didn't feel like I could share any of that joy or positivity with my parents because the change that was happening was too substantial. It was too negative for them to be able to show up for me in that way. And so I almost felt more like I had to conceal the best parts of this experience and this relationship from them to not cause any further problems. I think this kind of ties into this next point also. I think when you're raised in that kind of environment, you're not often given the opportunity to explore personal change. And that, again, covers kind of a wide range of behaviors and feelings. Maybe you didn't feel comfortable going out to the gym and working out around other people. And you've talked about that. Maybe you voiced that opinion. But you get to the point where you actually want to try it. Maybe you want to be a little bit more outgoing, or you're taking your physical health a bit more seriously and you want access to all of these machines and facilities. So you're willing to put yourself out there and entertain this change. Something as small as that can be a source of tension when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, because in their eyes, you've already expressed your opinion. And I think opinions to them are unchanging. So once you say something, it feels like you have to stick to it. Otherwise, you're a completely different person, and you might be made to feel bad for ever changing your mind. There's so much permanence, I think, attached to your opinions and your feelings that in an environment like that, change can sometimes feel impossible. I think there's a lot of guilt and shame that can be associated with change also, because it makes an emotionally immature person uncomfortable. And so they will take the steps to avoid experiencing that, no matter the cost, no matter who the other people are that they might be hurting in that process. And so the reason that I wanted to talk about change in this week's episode is because there have been some personal changes in my life over the last week or so that brought to the surface some of these ideas and realizations. And the first is a new person being introduced into my life, which once that experience was put in front of me, I started to realize that the people that are in my life now have been in my life for some time. And so I started to reflect and try to understand better maybe why that was the case. And it started to make more sense to me that having endured this sort of traumatic break from my immediate family, to then not long after that, having 3 of my closest friendships sort of disintegrate as a result of what I was going through at the time, sort of trying to understand what had happened in my personal life with my family. I was dealing with a lot of separation anxiety, and I didn't have a firm grasp on how I was feeling or how these earlier years of my life had impacted me and my relationships, the way that I navigate relationships. And so having so many really important, significant relationships of mine sort of no longer be a part of my life very suddenly. And these were people that I thought would be in my life for the rest of my life. I think that was really jarring. And I think experiencing that sense of loss made me that much more protective of myself and my inner circle, the people that I allow myself to be authentic and vulnerable around, that I pour a lot of time and energy into, because I've experienced, I guess, firsthand from a handful of people in a short amount of time, what it feels like to lose those years of memories and work and sacrifice and joy all at the same time. So one of my new challenges is to allow myself to be open, not only to new experiences and to change, but also to new relationships, and to really just kind of be present as I'm allowing these things to develop. I think also another change that I experienced this past week was that I didn't think very much about my parents. And, normally throughout the week, I will think about something or experience something that brings to the surface an emotion or a memory, and I'll jot it down in my journal and I'll revisit it in a video, or I'll do some research on this topic so that I can learn more about it. But this past week, my mind has really been elsewhere. I've been focusing on other things, more so things that are in the present. And in a way, I felt really good about that, because for me, it makes me feel like I am starting to define my life after this chapter, where I'm no longer consumed by these thoughts and memories of my past and relationships with people that I no longer talk to. And I'm sort of moving forward and I'm entering into this new chapter in my life, not only physically, but also mentally. I think mentally I'm much more present than I've been in the past. And I think this past week has sort of been a reflection of that. But on the other hand, there's, I think, a certain level of guilt that comes along with a realization like that, wow, I haven't thought about my parents much lately. Because, again, even if you have made the decision to go low or no contact, I think it's common deep down to feel like you wish that things were different. And so it can be sad in a way to feel like not thinking about them or your history, your past with them is actually a step in the right direction. I think anytime you distance yourself from an immediate family member, there's guilt that can creep in because of these ideas that we were raised around, that family first, family means everything. You should do everything and anything for your family because those are the people that mean the most to you. I think there's this idea that a lot of us have grown up around, this narrative that's really reinforced that in a perfect world, not only would we be able to believe, but we would also be able to put these things into practice in a healthy and positive way, where everyone involved was capable of the physical and emotional reciprocity necessary to maintain a relationship and really allow it to flourish. And yet, I think for a lot of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents or a narcissistic parent, we're not provided that opportunity. I think no matter what we do to try to mend a broken bond, if the other party isn't willing or able to self-reflect or make a genuine effort moving forward, then we kind of reach this point where we realize that we either have to stick around and deal with what's in front of us, or we have to start taking steps back and creating the life that we want for ourselves. And I guess the last change was that I reached out to an old friend of mine with a new perspective on our relationship and how things fizzled out towards the end. And I was proud of myself for being able to revisit this relationship and take responsibility for my part in things and in how things ended, and to hold myself accountable for my own words and behavior, despite maybe the emotional state that I was in at the time, despite the challenges personally that maybe I was facing. I think it was the first time in this relationship that I was able to really take myself out of the experience and put myself into the other person's shoes and imagine how that might have felt for them, and to kind of choose my words accordingly. And I think the ability to do that comes not only with self-reflection and emotional maturity, but also with a lot of acceptance. And I think that is one of the things that, again, emotionally immature parents lack. Anytime my parent would have any kind of a controversy with anyone, especially outside of the immediate family, their go-to was to just cut that person off. If they felt like they were wronged once, no matter how subtle or significant, that was their instinctual reaction, was to cut ties with that person and end the relationship. And I remember feeling like I did not want to be that. I remember seeing something online along the lines of, the biggest part of who I am is the person that I refuse to become. And while I don't think not becoming my parent is the most significant part of my personality, I definitely do think that that plays a role in my desire, my want to heal and to get better, because I've experienced firsthand what it's like to be around a person who is unwilling to put the work in. I know how that feels, and I would never want the people in my life that I care about or even once cared about in a past friendship or relationship to feel. And so I think approaching this conversation and reconnecting with this person, I think I first had to accept that I can't change people and I can't change my environment. I can't change the way that things happen. And what that brought to the surface for me was this idea. This mentality is wildly contradictory to the narrative that so many of us grew up around. I think when you're raised in that kind of environment, you're encouraged to try to fix problems that you cannot solve. Whether that's interjecting in an argument, thinking that, oh, well, if I come in and I back my parent up, then they'll be happy and things will go over smooth. Or if I'm always around, I can diffuse a situation before it even happens. I can say the right thing and I can end this controversy. I think no matter what it is, we're always kind of a sounding board for our emotionally immature parent. We listen to all of their problems and we feel this sense of responsibility to at least try to fix them. And so I think throughout our childhood, a lot of us were left with this false sense of power that we could do something about this as a result of constant pressure, scrutiny, and a desire for better. I remember always feeling like if there was anyone who could do something about this, it was me. Give me all of the baggage and let me sort through it and then give it back to you in a nice, neat, organized pile, because then we'll be able to deal with it, right? I think one of the biggest shifts that I have experienced from being raised in that kind of environment and existing in that environment for so long to now being in a healthy relationship and distancing myself from a lot of the chaos and toxicity is that my power is better utilized when I'm able to turn it inward. I think there are a lot of times when we expend our energy externally when we're raised in that kind of environment in an attempt to patch things up and to make things better because we really feel like we might be able to do that. And for me, it's been so beneficial to recognize that I cannot change the wind, but I can adjust my sails. This is something that Brandon and I have been talking about lately, and I think it's such a valuable idea to carry with you. Understanding that the people around you and your environment, your relationships, these are all things that are subject to change that, quite frankly, are not within your control. You can do things to maintain them, to maybe make them better. The things that you do influence these things, but they don't control them. And so regardless of what you're faced with, the only thing that you're able to control is your reaction to these things, how you handle them, and what you allow other people to get out of you, both good and bad. And I think that comes from turning your power inward. You're no longer expending this useless energy. Instead, you're actually making it useful and you're using it for yourself and in turn for these external circumstances. Because I think that's one of the ways to establish and maintain mental peace is being able to control your reactions, to control your response to things. And I think more specifically when we're dealing with emotionally immature parents and interacting with them, navigating a relationship with them, in my personal experience, I think because of the nature of our relationship, the closeness, they were able, more than anyone else in my life, to say things that were deeply triggering. And so despite the work that I was putting in behind the scenes personally and my ability to maintain calm, cool, and collected with other people in light of controversy, it always seemed like they were able to bring out the worst in me. And that took the most amount of practice, I think, is being able to recognize the situation and to become more observational instead of reactive. And it can be so much more challenging when you're dealing with a situation like that with a family member or with a parent to maintain this idea that you want to keep your power within yourself, because then in the same way as when you're dealing with a bully, they're picking on you most likely because of their own insecurities, but they're doing it to get a reaction out of you. I think it's a very similar experience with an emotionally immature parent. They are looking for a reaction. They're looking for that supply. And if you are able to deny them that, that might be one of the most effective ways for you no longer to be in the crosshairs. And so all of this, I think this ability to turn your power inwards comes from radical self-acceptance. I think there's a degree of self-confidence that needs to be present. There's a lot of introspection that I think needs to take place before you truly get here. But I think acceptance is sort of the cornerstone of all of this. It's acceptance of self, acceptance of your power and your capabilities, drawing the line between what you are and are not able to do and to change. I think, as a bit of a side note, when we think about the things that we are able to do, I think it's helpful to frame it in a way where we can influence certain things rather than control them. I think that's much more realistic and much more manageable, where let's say we're talking about a relationship between spouses, between partners. We can't control that relationship, but the things that we say and do can influence whether or not that relationship is successful or unsuccessful. I think, again, that's a much more realistic way to approach these kinds of situations and your role within them. And then, of course, there's the acceptance of your environment. I think naturally our environment is unpredictable. There are so many things that happen daily that are far beyond our control. And I think one of the beautiful things about recognizing this and truly starting to feel it is that you start to feel that much more grateful for the positive things in your life, that once you've had this realization, you start to understand you didn't have as much of a hand in bringing these things into your life as you might have once thought. And so all of these really great things, whether it was a result of fate or coincidence or lots of hard work, these things have found their way to you. And I think understanding and truly feeling that these things that you're so thankful for were beyond your control, and yet they somehow found their way into your life, it's hard to not feel thankful for that and to feel lucky to some extent. I think about meeting my husband, and that was the greatest thing to ever happen in my life. I feel like our relationship is the gift that keeps on giving, and it's the thing that I'm proudest of. And looking back, I know that there was nothing that I could have done in the grand scheme of things when we kind of zoom out and imagine the world and the universe that I could have done to make us meet, and to make us meet when we did as the people that we were, to have this incredible conversation and connection. Granted, certain things that I said or did influenced the ability for our relationship to flourish, but that initial connection, us being in the same place at the same time, is far beyond my capabilities. And when you start to take that step back and zoom out, you find yourself feeling like there are a lot of things that you can be grateful for. And I think that is one of the most beneficial and potentially life-changing in terms of a mentality shift aspects of this realization of understanding your own power, your own limits, and where you stand in your ability to change things within your own life. With that, I think change and learning to welcome change is a lot like healing, because it's work. I think when you're dealing with a predictable environment, you're remaining within what feels familiar to you, you're able to predict how you might feel, how things might go. It feels much safer. But because of the nature of change, it is inherently harder to predict. And so you have to sort of leave yourself open to experiencing these situations or emotions as they come. And you have to develop this self-trust that the version of you that is faced with, whether it's a challenge or an emotion or a relationship, whatever it might be that's right in front of you, the version of you that is faced with that will be able to handle it. And that takes time and that takes work to feel that self-confidence, to develop that self-trust. And for me, what I have found, especially in, protecting my inner peace and my inner circle, is that when I'm faced with a new person, something that's unpredictable, maybe a new relationship, that opens the door for a bit of anxiety for me, for more negative, intrusive thoughts. And I talked about this briefly in a video, but having this experience recently really opened my eyes to how much intrusive thoughts are a method of self-protection. I think we want to be able to know how we're feeling. We don't want to be caught off guard by anything. And I think for a lot of us throughout childhood, imagining every single scenario and what we would say or do or feel in that scenario was a positive thing. It's really difficult to shake that in adulthood because we don't want to be left feeling blindsided. And so we almost feel compelled to imagine all of these different hypothetical scenarios so that we can better protect ourselves if and when these negative things do come into our lives. Because it's like we've already experienced. I've thought about this. I've felt this emotion. I've processed this to one extent or another. But again, in keeping with this theme of shifting our mentality, I want to challenge you to a bit of a thought experiment, where anytime you're dealing with a negative, intrusive thought, which intrusive thoughts tend to be more negative, they sort of play on your deepest rooted fears and insecurities, I want you to try to take yourself out of it and to allow yourself to imagine the opposite. Take your emotions out of the situation. It doesn't necessarily matter in the moment how you're feeling one way or the other. If you're able to take a step back and entertain the idea that everything between the really, really scary negative and the really almost unrealistic positive are capable of happening, I think that can sometimes calm these intrusive thoughts. It can kind of fight against them. It's the idea of sort of allowing these two thoughts, these two potential future scenarios to coexist and to let neither dictate how you feel before these things actually happen. Because that, I think, is where a lot of anxiety comes into play, when you try to anticipate what's going to happen without actually knowing it for certain. It's a lot of wasted mental energy, I think. And so allowing yourself to entertain the idea that, yes, something negative might happen, but something positive might happen too, or nothing at all might happen. There is an infinite number of scenarios that might be thrown my way, and it's kind of useless for me to expend all of this mental energy that is so valuable that I could be using elsewhere on this thought, on this thing that there's no way for me to predict or control. And it's really nice, especially when you're dealing with certain things in your life. I caught myself thinking about this new person, this new relationship, having these intrusive thoughts and thinking, well, what happens if this happens? I'm not going to feel good about that. I'm going to be scared by that. And it's not going to feel good. How do I fight against this? How do I combat this so that it doesn't happen? And then, I caught myself just caught up in this negativity. And I asked myself, well, how do I want this to go? Do I want this to be a negative experience? Do I not want to allow space for this relationship in my life at all? And I thought to myself, no, I think it would be a positive thing. I think it would be a healthy thing. And so why don't I start imagining all of the things that could go right and the things that I can do within that relationship and experience to influence it, to allow it to go right so that it's more easily kind of on that positive trajectory. I think it's easy for us to kind of default to the negative, to something bad happening, because that is what we've grown accustomed to throughout our childhood. And so we learn to expect that from other people and other relationships. But the truth of the matter is we can go into something optimistic. We can go into something realistic. And our thoughts and actions and emotions can fall in line. And that, I think, can be a really positive thing to carry with us moving forward. This idea that things that once scared us can turn out even better than we imagined. And I think a lot of times the root of that is allowing ourselves to be open, which we can do through learning to welcome change. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this week's episode, but I will be back next week with a very special episode. I'm going to be doing a Q&A for next week's episode, for episode 35. So if you have any questions or a topic that you would like me to address specifically, head over either to my TikTok or Instagram. You can even email me with those questions and I'll sort through them, and I'm going to answer as many of them as I can in next week's episode. So if you like this week's topic, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel if you're watching on YouTube, or leave us a rating if you're listening on Spotify. I'll be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.